What if everything you were taught about the beginning of human civilization is wrong? Not slightly wrong, not missing a few details, but fundamentally inverted. What if the story we call the dawn of history is actually the aftermath of something far older, far stranger, and far more advanced than we are prepared to accept? According to one of the oldest texts ever discovered, before human history as we know it even began, Earth was ruled by just 8 kings. Their combined reign did not last centuries, or even millennia, but an almost incomprehensible span of time, 241,200 years. These rulers did not merely govern early cities. They presided over a world that existed long before the Great Flood, long before recorded time, long before the civilizations we place at the beginning of history. This is not speculation pulled from a modern conspiracy theory. It is written plainly, numerically, and without poetry in an ancient Sumerian document known as the Sumerian King List, and it has been sitting in a museum for over a century. The artifact itself is unremarkable at first glance. A small 4-sided clay prism, no larger than a paperback book, baked hard in antiquity and inscribed from top to bottom in wedge-shaped cuneiform script. It was unearthed in the early 20th century from the ruins of ancient Sumer in what is now modern-day Iraq. Archaeologists expected the usual things: records of grain, temple inventories, trade agreements. What they found instead was a ledger of kings. Not legends, not hymns, a list, names, cities, lengths of reign, and then the numbers appeared. The list begins with a sentence so simple and yet so destabilizing that it quietly dismantles our entire framework of early history. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Kingship did not emerge gradually. It did not evolve from village elders or tribal councils. It descended, fully formed, already established, already legitimate. The first king named is Alalim, ruler of Eridu. According to the text, he reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. The third king, Enmenluana, held power for 43,200 years. The list continues through 8 kings across 5 cities. Each reign measured not in decades, but in tens of thousands of years. When the scribe finishes tallying their rule, he adds a total with bureaucratic indifference. 8 kings ruled for 241,200 years. Then, without warning, the text stops. Not with a conclusion, not with an explanation, just a single chilling line. Then the flood swept over. To the modern mind, this is where the story should end. Numbers like these are impossible. No human being can live for 28,000 years. No civilization could persist unchanged for 250,000 years. And so, for decades, scholars dismissed this entire pre-flood section as myth, symbolic rulers, legendary gods, a creation story, not history. Case closed, except the tablet doesn't end there. After the flood, the list simply resumes. New cities, new kings, new reigns. But now the numbers change. Reigns shrink dramatically. Hundreds of years, then decades, then spans entirely consistent with real human lifetimes. And suddenly, unmistakably, the list names kings we know were real historical figures. Most famously, Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, a ruler whose city walls have been excavated, whose name appears in multiple independent inscriptions, whose epic is the oldest surviving work of literature in human history. The same document that claims Gilgamesh ruled for 126 years also claims Alalim ruled for 28,800. Same handwriting, same tone, same format. The scribe makes no distinction between myth and history. To him, it is one continuous record, broken only by a catastrophic flood that divided the world into before and after. This creates a problem that cannot be ignored. If the later part of the list is historical, why is the earlier part automatically dismissed? Why would a document be precise and factual for the last few thousand years, but pure fantasy for the first 200,000? And why would a myth use such rigid mathematics? Because these numbers are not random. They follow a system. The Sumerians used a base 60 mathematical structure. Their highest unit of time was the Sar, equal to 3,600 years. When the reigns of the antediluvian kings are examined through this lens, a pattern emerges. 28,800 years equals exactly 8 Sar, 36,000 years equals 10 Sar, 43,200 years equals 12 Sar. These are not exaggerated guesses. They are deliberate, calculated values, built on cosmological mathematics. This is accounting, not storytelling. The scribes believed they were recording something ordered, something real. And that leads to a question that refuses to go away. If these kings were not human, then what were they? The clue may lie in that first sentence again. Kingship descended from heaven. For the Sumerians, authority did not originate on earth. Rule was granted, delivered, installed. This idea echoes through their mythology, the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, powerful beings who shaped humanity, established cities, and determined the structure of civilization itself. In this context, the Sumerian King List reads less like a myth and more like a memory of governance under non-human rulers, beings whose lifespans operated on a scale entirely different from our own. And if that sounds impossible, consider the city where it all began, Eridu. Archaeology confirms Eridu as one of the oldest known settlements on Earth. Its earliest layers show an unexpected level of sophistication, as if the city appeared already organized, already sacred. Its central temple was rebuilt obsessively, layer upon layer, as though maintaining a connection to something that once existed there. Sumerian texts say Eridu was the home of Enki, the god of wisdom, science, and creation, the architect of civilization, the engineer of humanity. If kingship was delivered from heaven, Eridu was the landing point. This reframes everything. Civilization did not slowly invent itself. It was structured, installed, guided, and ruled by figures whose reigns were measured not in human years, but in cosmic cycles. The Sumerian King List does not ask us politely to reconsider history. It forces the question, was the age before the flood a myth, or was it a forgotten chapter of reality? And if it was real, then humanity did not begin at the dawn of civilization. We inherited the ruins of a world that came before. To understand why the Sumerian King List is so dangerous to our modern timeline, we need to confront what it is actually claiming, not what we wish it were claiming. It is not presenting a symbolic myth about gods in the abstract. It is presenting a bureaucratic record of governance. Cities are named. Authority is transferred. Capitals move. Reigns are counted. Totals are calculated. And then everything is interrupted by a catastrophe so severe that it permanently alters the nature of rule itself. This is not how myths are written. Myths explain the world. This document organizes it. The moment we stop dismissing the first half of the list, an entirely different picture of early Earth begins to emerge. A picture in which civilization did not crawl upward from chaos, but descended into order. A picture where humanity did not invent kingship, but received it. And a picture where the beings who ruled before the flood were operating on a scale of time that no human society could sustain on its own. The key to this picture lies in how the Sumerians understood authority. For them, kingship was not political power. It was a cosmic function, something that existed independently of any individual ruler. Kingship could move from city to city, even if the city itself fell. It could be taken away. It could be restored. It did not belong to humans. Humans merely held it temporarily. That alone is a radical departure from modern assumptions. In the Sumerian worldview, the first king was not a man who seized control. He was a recipient, an appointee, a custodian of a system that already existed. This explains why the list opens the way it does. It does not say, the first king ruled Eridu. It says, kingship descended from heaven, and then it was in Eridu. The city is secondary. Kingship comes first. And when we follow that logic forward, the implications become unsettling. If kingship existed before cities, then cities were not experiments. They were implementations. If kingship descended from heaven, then governance was not learned. It was taught. And if the reigns of the first rulers were measured in Sar cycles, then the beings holding power were not bound to human biology. This is where the Anunnaki enter the picture, not as mythological decorations, but as functional administrators in a very old system. The Sumerians did not describe their gods as distant creators who vanished after shaping the world. They described them as present, active, and deeply involved in human affairs. They argued, they negotiated, they issued decrees, they punished, rewarded, engineered, and instructed. Enki Enlil, Inanna, Utu. These were not abstract forces. They were personalities with jurisdictions. One controlled wisdom and creation. Another controlled authority and command. Another controlled fertility and power. Another controlled justice and observation. This is not a pantheon of nature spirits. It looks far more like a hierarchy, and hierarchies require management. The Sumerian King List may therefore represent something far more concrete than myth. It may be a record of administrative eras, each king representing not a single immortal individual, but a governing entity or leadership role held continuously over vast spans of time. But even if we entertain that idea, the numbers still refuse to shrink. 28,000 years is not symbolic longevity, it is operational permanence. What kind of civilization requires stability on that scale? What kind of project operates uninterrupted for nearly 250,000 years? At this point, the traditional narrative of human development begins to fracture. Modern history tells us agriculture began around 12,000 years ago. Cities emerged around 6,000 years ago. Writing appeared around 5,000 years ago. Everything before that is described as primitive, scattered, and transient. Yet the Sumerian King List insists that before any of that, there existed organized rule, named cities, centralized authority, and a continuity of governance that outlasts all recorded history combined. This contradiction cannot be resolved by simply calling one side wrong. Either the King List is fiction on a scale so precise it mimics data, or our understanding of prehistory is catastrophically incomplete. The flood becomes the pivot point, because after it, everything changes. The list resumes, but the tone subtly shifts. The kings are still kings, but their reigns shorten drastically. Hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands. Then lifespans collapse further. The divine era is over. The age of diminished rulers begins. This mirrors something deeply familiar. In the Bible, before the flood, figures like Methuselah live nearly 1,000 years. After the flood, lifespans shrink steadily until they resemble modern human limits. In other words, multiple ancient traditions remember the same thing, a break in time where longevity was lost. The Sumerian King List is not unique in remembering this loss. It is simply the most mathematically explicit about it. And that raises another disturbing possibility. What if the flood was not just a natural disaster? What if it was a system reset? The text does not describe divine regret. It does not moralize. It does not explain why the flood happened. It treats it like an event so obvious, so final, that no explanation is needed. That kind of neutrality is strange for mythology, but it makes sense for a report. In this interpretation, the flood was not the beginning of the story humanity remembers. It was the end of a world humanity inherited. The kings before the flood were not ancestors in the biological sense. They were overseers, architects of a civilization whose traces were largely erased. And when the waters receded, humanity was left with fragments, myths, symbols, rituals, and a deeply ingrained memory that once, long ago, the world was ruled by beings who were not like us. We remember them as gods, but perhaps they were something else entirely. And if that is true, then the Sumerian King List is not just an ancient curiosity. It is a boundary marker between two versions of history, one we are comfortable with, and one we have not yet dared to fully confront. If the world before the flood truly operated under a different order, then the cities named in the Sumerian King List are not just places on a map. They are stages in a long, deliberate process. Each capital marks a shift in focus, a change in function, as if the system governing Earth was evolving through planned phases rather than drifting through chance. The first of these, Eridu, represents origin, not merely the first city, but the conceptual foundation of civilization itself. Archaeology confirms Eridu's extreme antiquity, yet what is most striking is how fully formed it appears in its earliest layers. There is no long, clumsy transition from nomadic life to urban complexity. Instead, we find an organized settlement with ritual architecture already in place. It is as though the city arrived knowing what it was for. Sumerian tradition tells us why. Eridu was the domain of Enki, the god of wisdom, engineering, creation, and hidden knowledge. He was not a warrior king or a tyrant. He was a planner, a designer, the one who understood systems, If kingship descended from heaven, Enki was the architect of that descent. In the language of myth, Enki shaped humanity from clay. In the language of administration, he would be the one who designed the framework within which humanity could function. Laws, crafts, writing, measurement, medicine, and governance were all said to flow from him. Under this interpretation, Eridu was not simply a city. It was a control center, a place where the blueprint of civilization was established. The reigns of the first two kings, Alulim and Alalgar, stretch across nearly 65,000 years combined. During this time, the King List reports no upheaval, no collapse, no change of capital. Kingship remains stable, anchored in Eridu. This suggests a period of extraordinary continuity, as though the system had reached equilibrium. Nothing needed to change because nothing was failing. Then something shifts. Kingship is transferred from Eridu to a new city, Bad Tibera. The name itself is revealing. Often translated as Fortress of the Metalworkers, Bad Tibera immediately signals a change in priorities. This is no longer about foundational knowledge or abstract order. This is about material transformation, industry, extraction, production. To ancient peoples, metallurgy was not simply a technical skill, it was a sacred act. The ability to pull metal from stone and reshape it through fire appeared divine. It required knowledge hidden from ordinary life, guarded by specialists and controlled by authority. The rise of Bad Tibera suggests the beginning of a technological phase, where humanity was taught not only how to live together, but how to reshape the physical world. The first king of Bad Tibera, Enmenlu-Ana, ruled for 43,200 years, exactly 12 Sa. 12, the number of completeness, order, and cosmic structure. This was not a random reign length. It signals a full cycle, a closed system operating as intended. Under this reign, Bad Tibera would have functioned as the industrial heart of the antediluvian world. Mining, metalwork, large-scale production. Not the crude experimentation of early humans, but organized, sustained technological activity carried out across thousands of generations. This aligns disturbingly well with later Sumerian myths that describe the gods requiring resources from Earth. Gold, in particular, appears repeatedly as a sacred and necessary material. In this framework, Bad Tibera was not just a city, it was infrastructure. When Enmenlu-Ana's reign ends, kingship does not collapse. It remains in Bad Tibera, passing to Enmengal-Ana, whose reign lasts 28,800 years, mirroring that of Alulim. This repetition of numbers suggests intentional design, a return to balance after an era of expansion. Sumerian texts associate this phase with the establishment of the Mi, the divine decrees or organizing principles of civilization. These were not abstract moral ideas. They were described as tangible, transferable objects that governed everything from kingship and law to music, writing, and craftsmanship. In modern terms, the Mi function like system protocols, defining how society operates at every level. If Enmenlu-Ana represents the mastery of matter, then Enmengal-Ana represents the mastery of social order. Together, they complete the technological and administrative structure of the pre-flood world. The final king of Bad Tibera, Dumuzid, marks a dramatic shift in tone. Unlike the silent, almost mechanical figures before him, Dumuzid is remembered vividly in later myth. He is called the Shepherd, a title that emphasizes guidance rather than control. His reign lasts 36,000 years, 10 Sa, and his story does not end with administration. Dumuzid becomes the central figure in a cosmic tragedy. He is the lover of Inanna, the goddess of fertility and power. When Inanna descends into the underworld and becomes trapped, Dumuzid is taken in her place. His death brings barrenness to the land. His return restores life. This is not just a seasonal myth. It is the template for one of the most powerful religious patterns in human history: the dying and rising god. Osiris in Egypt, Tammuz in Babylon, Adonis in Greece. Even later salvation narratives echo this structure. What makes Dumuzid unsettling is that the King List treats him as both a historical ruler and a divine figure without contradiction. He ruled for thousands of years, and he died. He governed cities, and he became a god. This tells us something crucial about the antediluvian worldview. The boundary between ruler and deity did not exist. Authority was sacred because it was not human in origin. With Dumuzid, the industrial phase of the world before the flood reaches its emotional peak. Power, productivity, and order have been established. But something is changing. The narrative becomes more personal, more fragile, as if the system itself is beginning to strain. And then kingship moves again, this time to a city that has never been found. Larak. A capital with no ruins, no confirmed location, no archaeological footprint. It exists only in the text. That absence is not insignificant. Larak suggests secrecy, transition, a phase of governance that left no visible trace. The king who ruled there, Ensipat-Zid-Ana, reigned for 28,800 years, returning once more to the number associated with balance and stability. Later traditions link Larak to the god Ninurta, a figure of both destruction and healing, warfare and agriculture, floods and irrigation. This duality implies management of forces that are both creative and catastrophic. If Eridu was foundation and Bad Tibera was industry, Larak may represent control, environmental regulation, planetary balance, a behind-the-scenes operation maintaining conditions necessary for the system to continue. The fact that Larak cannot be found may itself be the point. Some functions are not meant to be seen, and as kingship prepares to move once more, the pattern becomes clear. The antediluvian world was not static. It was managed, structured, phased, and whatever was governing it was preparing for something humanity did not yet understand. When kingship moved from the unseen city of Larak to Sippar, the tone of the antediluvian story shifted once again. If Larak represented hidden control and planetary balance, Sippar stood in full illumination. It was the city of the sun. Sippar was dedicated to Utu, later known as Shamash, the god of the sun, justice, truth, and divine law. Unlike other deities who ruled through mystery or raw power, Utu ruled through visibility. He saw everything. Nothing was hidden from him. Every contract, every oath, every crime, every secret act fell under his gaze. In human terms, Sippar was the center of judgment, knowledge, and surveillance. Archaeology confirms Sippar as a real and important city. Its ruins have been found, its temples excavated, its role in Mesopotamian civilization firmly established. But once again, the King List places Sippar far deeper in time than mainstream history allows. And the king who ruled there, Enmendur-Ana, is one of the most extraordinary figures in the entire record. His reign is listed as 21,000 years, shorter than those before him, yet still impossibly long. But his importance does not lie in the length of his rule. It lies in what happens to him. Later, Sumerian and Akkadian texts tell us that Enmendur-Ana was chosen by the gods themselves. He was taken up into heaven, not in metaphor, not in death, but physically. He was seated on a throne of gold and instructed in divine secrets. The gods taught him the arts of divination, astronomy, mathematics, and sacred law. He learned how to read signs in oil and water, how to interpret the liver of sacrificial animals, how to understand the language of the heavens. When he returned to Earth, he did not rule merely as a king. He became the first priest king, the founder of a lineage whose power came from knowledge rather than force. He passed this wisdom to chosen successors, establishing the priesthood as an institution that would endure long after the flood erased the old world. This story is so precise, so specific, that it resists easy dismissal as myth, and its echo appears elsewhere, almost unchanged. In the Hebrew tradition, there is a figure named Enoch. He walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. He did not die. He ascended. In later Jewish mysticism, Enoch becomes Metatron, the scribe of heaven, the keeper of divine knowledge. The parallel is unmistakable. Two ancient traditions, separated by language and culture, describe a man who is taken alive into the realm of the gods, taught cosmic secrets, and transformed into a bridge between heaven and earth. This is not coincidence, it is convergence. From a conventional perspective, Enmendur-Ana represents the mythological origin of priestly authority. Kings rule bodies, priests rule meaning. They interpret signs, control rituals, define truth. In a world rebuilding itself after catastrophe, such power would be invaluable. But from a more radical perspective, Enmendur-Ana's ascent reads like a transfer of information. A chosen human being brought into direct contact with a higher intelligence and then returned as a carrier of knowledge. A controlled release of advanced understanding into a population not yet ready to receive it openly. Sipar then becomes the final visible node of the antediluvian system, a place where divine oversight, knowledge transmission, and human governance intersected openly. Unlike Larak, Sipar left ruins. Unlike Bad Tibera, it was not about production. Unlike Eridu, it was not about origin. It was about continuity. Because by the time kingship resided in Sipar, the long arc of the old world was nearing its end. The reign of Enmendur-Ana carries a quiet tension. His knowledge is vast, but his era is shorter. His connection to the gods is direct, but it feels like preparation, not expansion. As if the system knows it is approaching a boundary, and then kingship moves one final time to Shuruppak. Unlike Larak, Shuruppak is not hidden. Its ruins have been found. Its flood layer is real. Archaeologists uncovered thick deposits of river silt, separating earlier occupation from later rebuilding. The city was destroyed by water, and the king who ruled there, Ubara-Tutu, would become the last ruler of the world before it ended. His reign, 18,600 years, is the shortest of all the antediluvian kings. Time is compressing, stability is fading. The long calm of tens of thousands of years is collapsing into urgency. Ubara-Tutu himself remains mostly silent in the record, but his son does not. His son is Utnapishtim, the man who survives the flood. At this point, the King List does something extraordinary. After thousands of years of meticulous accounting, it stops. Not gradually, not poetically. It stops with a single sentence. Then the flood swept over. No drama, no explanation, no warning, just an erasure. This is not the language of myth. It is the language of record-keeping, of administration, of someone marking the end of a system and the beginning of another. Everything before that line belongs to a different world, and everything after belongs to ours. When the flood came, it did not merely destroy cities, it severed a way of being. The world that emerged after the waters receded was recognizably human, but fundamentally diminished. The Sumerian King List makes this clear, not through commentary, but through numbers. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, those numbers collapse, lifespans shrink, authority changes. Something essential is gone. Kingship, the text tells us, descended from heaven again, but this time it settled in Kish. The phrase is familiar, yet it no longer carries the same weight. The descent feels ceremonial now, not literal. The reigns that follow stretch hundreds of years at first, then decades, then finally into spans that match our own experience of time. Immortality has been withdrawn. This sudden biological and political contraction appears across multiple traditions. In the Hebrew scriptures, the patriarchs before the flood live for centuries. After Noah, lifespans steadily decline until they stabilize around 100 years. In Mesopotamia, the same pattern unfolds in parallel. The flood is not just a natural disaster, it is a boundary event, a reset. What exactly was reset remains the central mystery. From one perspective, the flood marks the end of divine rule and the beginning of human autonomy. The gods retreat. Kings become men. History, as we know it, begins. This is the version taught in textbooks, stripped of its implications and reduced to myth. But the King List refuses to let the transition feel symbolic. The continuity is too precise. The same scribes, the same structure, the same administrative tone flows seamlessly from gods to men. There is no acknowledgement that anything supernatural has ended, only that something irreversible has happened. The Epic of Gilgamesh fills in the emotional gap the King List leaves open. Gilgamesh, listed as a post-flood king, is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He stands at the threshold between eras. He knows instinctively that something was lost. And his entire story is driven by that knowledge. When his companion Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh does not mourn as a man would. He panics. He sees his own mortality reflected back at him and rejects it. He sets out to find Utnapishtim, the one man who crossed the flood and lived forever. This journey is not heroic in the usual sense. It is desperate. Gilgamesh is not seeking glory. He is seeking restitution. He wants back what was taken from the world. When he finally reaches Utnapishtim, the truth is devastating. Immortality was a one-time exception, a closed door. The age when gods walked openly among humans is over. The world has been reconfigured, and there is no going back. This moment is critical. It confirms that the flood was not only a physical catastrophe, but a structural one. The rules of existence changed. If the Anunnaki interpretation is considered, the implications deepen further. The flood becomes less like an accident and more like a controlled termination. A decision point. A project concluded. The long-lived rulers, whether gods, hybrids, or something else entirely, disappear from the record. Humanity is left behind with fragments of knowledge, echoes of memory, and a governance system designed for obedience rather than longevity. The gods do not vanish completely. They remain in stories, rituals, and temples, but their presence becomes indirect, symbolic, intermediated through priests rather than kings. In this light, religion itself may be a survival mechanism, a way to preserve contact with something that once ruled directly but now governs from a distance. Prayer replaces instruction, faith replaces dialogue, and yet the memory persists. The flood myth does not fade. It appears everywhere. Different names, different settings, the same structure. A world-ending deluge, a chosen survivor, a rebirth into a lesser age. Such consistency suggests more than imagination. It suggests inheritance. The King List, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Bible, and countless other traditions may not be telling different stories at all. They may be telling the same story from different vantage points. The story of a civilization that did not begin with humans, but ended with them. After the flood, humanity inherits the earth, not as creators, but as caretakers of ruins they no longer understand. The age of gods ends quietly, and the age of men begins in the mud. What follows the end of divine rule is not enlightenment, but confusion. The post-flood world does not rise smoothly into civilization. It stumbles. Cities appear, but they are smaller. Knowledge survives, but in fragments. The great precision, the vast timescales, the direct connection to the heavens are gone. What remains is imitation. This is one of the strangest features of early human history. The oldest structures are often the most sophisticated. The earliest myths are the most complex. The first cities appear with laws, astronomy, mathematics, and writing already in place, as if humanity did not invent these systems step by step, but inherited them incomplete. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to invent civilization. They insisted it was given. Writing was a gift from the gods. Law came from the gods. Kingship descended from heaven. Even after the flood, this belief did not change. What changed was access. Instead of gods ruling openly, humans ruled in their name. This shift is subtle, but profound. Authority becomes symbolic. Ritual replaces instruction. Temples replace command centers. Priests replace administrators. Civilization becomes an echo of something more direct and more powerful that once existed. Look closely at the first post-flood cities: Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash. They rise rapidly, already organized. Streets are planned. Bureaucracy is standardized. Time is measured with inherited systems based on 60. The same mathematical framework used to describe the reigns of antediluvian kings now governs trade, astronomy, and calendars. This continuity should not exist if everything began from scratch. Even the gods themselves seem diminished. In earlier myths, they walk, argue, build, and rule. In later traditions, they withdraw. They speak through omens, dreams, and signs. Their presence becomes distant, abstract, increasingly moral rather than practical. Something has broken. If the Anunnaki hypothesis is set aside entirely, the pattern still remains. Human memory preserves the shape of a lost age, even when its meaning is gone. Myths act as containers, carrying corrupted data forward through time. This is why so many ancient stories feel strangely technological when read carefully. Flying chariots, weapons of light, voices from the sky. These are not proof of advanced machines, but they may be proof of misremembered experiences translated into symbolic language. A society without context mythologizes what it cannot explain, and so humanity rebuilds, slowly, imperfectly. Kings claim divine descent, but they die. Empires rise, but they collapse. Knowledge accumulates, but it is repeatedly lost. Fire, flood, famine, and war erase progress again and again. This cycle itself may be another inheritance. If earlier civilizations rose high and fell catastrophically, their survivors would pass down not only stories, but instincts, fear of hubris, obsession with order, the belief that chaos follows disobedience, that the gods punish excess. These ideas become embedded in law and religion. They shape behavior long after their original cause is forgotten. By the time history becomes fully human, the world is already haunted. Haunted by ruins beneath the earth, haunted by myths that refuse to die, haunted by a sense that something greater once existed and was lost forever. The flood did not erase memory, it fragmented it, and fragments, when carried long enough, become destiny. As human civilization continues forward into what we call recorded history, an unsettling pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Progress does not move in a straight line. It advances in bursts, followed by collapse, followed by long periods of forgetting. This rhythm mirrors the deeper structure suggested by the Sumerian King List and the flood narratives that surround it. Humanity does not simply learn and improve. It remembers, loses, and remembers again. Across continents, early societies emerge already carrying sophisticated ideas they should not yet possess. Astronomy appears fully formed, with precise tracking of planetary cycles and eclipses. Architecture aligns with solstices and stars. Mythology encodes mathematical ratios and cosmological principles that only make sense when viewed from a much higher vantage point than simple survival requires. These are not the products of trial and error farming communities. They look like remnants. Consider how often ancient cultures describe their knowledge as restoration rather than invention. Egyptian priests spoke of rebuilding wisdom from a time before the destruction. Mesoamerican traditions describe previous suns, previous worlds that ended in catastrophe. Hindu cosmology lays out vast cycles of creation and collapse, with each age ending more diminished than the last. Even Plato, writing in classical Greece, speaks of Atlantis as an advanced civilization, destroyed in a single night of floods and earthquakes long before his time. These stories persist because they serve a purpose. They warn, they explain, they contextualize suffering. If humanity once lived under a system of direct guidance, whether divine, advanced, or simply forgotten, then the loss of that system would leave a psychological scar. The fear of collapse would become encoded into culture. The obsession with appeasing gods, maintaining order, and fearing cosmic punishment begins to look less like superstition and more like inherited trauma. This may explain why early civilizations were so preoccupied with cycles. Calendars were not just tools for agriculture, they were instruments of survival. To know when the heavens would shift, when floods might come, when the world might turn hostile again was a matter of existential importance. Time itself became sacred. Power structures reflect this anxiety. Kings were no longer immortal, but they claimed legitimacy through proximity to the past. Bloodlines mattered, lineage mattered. The closer one could trace their ancestry to gods, heroes, or survivors of the flood, the stronger their claim to rule. Authority became genealogical memory. This fixation persists even today. Modern institutions no longer invoke gods openly, but they still rely on inherited structures. Governments, corporations, and global systems are built on hierarchies that mirror ancient command chains. At the top, a few make decisions that affect billions. The shape of power has not changed much. Only the language has. If the antediluvian world truly existed, its most enduring legacy may not be technology, but organization. The idea that order must come from above, that chaos is humanity's natural state unless guided, that progress requires control. This worldview carries consequences. It breeds dependency. It encourages obedience. It frames catastrophe as inevitable rather than preventable. If destruction is cyclical and ordained, resistance feels futile. Preparation becomes ritual instead of action. Yet buried beneath this inherited mindset is another possibility. The flood did not only end an age, it forced humanity to adapt, to survive without guardians, to innovate independently. The post-flood world is smaller, harsher, and more fragile, but it is also freer. Humanity is no longer managed, no longer supervised. For the first time, the future is uncertain because it is genuinely human. This tension defines everything that follows. We build civilizations while fearing their collapse. We reach for the stars while haunted by memories of falling. We search endlessly for meaning because we sense it was once given to us directly. Whether the antediluvian kings were gods, advanced beings, or symbols of forgotten dynasties, their disappearance created a vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped myth, religion, philosophy, and eventually science. All different attempts to answer the same silent question. What happened before us? The Sumerian King List does not answer that question. It preserves it. It stands as a boundary marker between what is remembered and what is lost. A document that refuses to let history feel complete. Because if there truly was a time when humanity lived differently, longer, closer to the source of its knowledge, then our story is not one of ascent, but of recovery. And recovery is never linear. It is fragile, it is uneven, and it is always incomplete. If the previous ideas suggest that humanity may be remembering rather than evolving, then the implication becomes far more unsettling. The real problem may not be that something was forgotten over time, but that something was deliberately taken away. Not erased by decay, not lost to chaos, but severed at a precise moment. Across every ancient tradition, one event stands as a clean dividing line. The Great Flood. Not merely a natural disaster, not just rising waters and drowned cities. In every culture where this story appears, the flood represents a boundary between two fundamentally different states of existence. Before it, humans lived longer, closer to the divine, closer to knowledge that felt integrated into the fabric of the world itself. After it, life shortened, memory fractured, and understanding was replaced by belief. The consistency of this pattern is impossible to ignore. The Sumerian King List does not simply describe long reigns. It describes a different condition of reality. A world where time moved differently, where authority was stable for spans that dwarf all of recorded history, where civilization did not feel fragile or temporary. Then suddenly, everything contracts. Lifespans collapse. Power fragments. Knowledge retreats into myth. History, as we recognize it, begins. The unsettling possibility is that the flood was not the cause of the collapse, but the mechanism. A reset rather than an accident. If the pre-flood kings were real in any meaningful sense, whether biologically different, technologically augmented, or simply existing under environmental conditions no longer present, then the question is not who they were. The question is why they were removed. Every civilization that followed carried a quiet obsession with endings. Egypt sought immortality through stone. Mesopotamia preserved memory in clay. India accepted destruction as cyclical. China warned that heaven would withdraw its mandate. None believed permanence was possible. All understood that collapse was not hypothetical, but inevitable. That shared intuition suggests inherited knowledge, not coincidence. After the flood, the gods retreat. They no longer walk among humans. They no longer rule directly. Communication becomes symbolic. Dreams replace dialogue. Ritual replaces instruction. Authority becomes invisible. Fear replaces familiarity. This is the birth of organized religion. Religion does not emerge from ignorance. It emerges from loss, from the sudden absence of a presence that was once tangible. Myths are not inventions. They are distorted memories, carried forward by cultures that lack the language to describe advanced realities with precision. Technology becomes magic. Engineering becomes divine wrath. Long-lived beings become immortals. The King List stands apart because it refuses to dramatize. It lists names, cities, numbers. Then it stops. Then the flood swept over. No embellishment, no moral framing, just a break in continuity. That silence is more disturbing than any myth. If the document is even partially historical, then civilization did not rise from simplicity into complexity. It fell from something far more stable into fragility. What we call progress may be nothing more than a slow climb back toward a level that once existed. This would explain why breakthroughs in human history appear abruptly rather than gradually. Writing, agriculture, astronomy, metallurgy do not emerge through long experimental phases. They appear almost fully formed, as if remembered. If that is true, then the deeper question is unavoidable. What happens when a civilization approaches the same threshold again? Every civilization before ours collapsed not at its weakest moment, but at its strongest, at the point where knowledge, control, and self-sufficiency reached a critical level. Perhaps the cycle does not punish failure. Perhaps it corrects convergence. The King List does not warn, it documents. It describes a world that existed before ours, governed for unimaginable spans of time, and then erased almost entirely. What survived was not the infrastructure, not the rulers, not the system itself, but fragments of memory carried forward in myth, ritual, and fear. Today, humanity stands at a familiar edge. Global connectivity, genetic manipulation, artificial intelligence, climate intervention, extended lifespan. These are not new ambitions. They are ancient ones. They are the attributes of gods in every myth. Every civilization that touched them before us disappeared. If the cycle still exists, then the question is not whether it will return, but whether we will recognize it in time. The Sumerian King List may not be a story about the past at all. It may be a quiet record of what happens when a civilization reaches too far, too fast, too close to something it is not meant to become. The silence between the names and the flood is not empty. It is a warning that does not need to speak. Humanity has always told itself a comforting story about progress. A story where knowledge accumulates, mistakes are corrected, and each generation stands a little higher than the last. But when the fragments of the ancient world are placed side by side, a far more troubling pattern emerges. Progress does not move forward in a straight line. It rises, plateaus, and then vanishes. Again and again, not because humanity fails, but because something intervenes when a certain threshold is reached. The civilizations before ours did not collapse in ignorance. They collapsed at the height of understanding. This is the detail that most modern interpretations quietly avoid. The great flood myths are not stories about primitive people being punished for moral corruption. They are stories about advanced societies being erased at a moment of peak capability. The flood is never described as gradual. It arrives suddenly. It resets the board cleanly. Survivors are few. Knowledge is fragmented. Memory is reduced to symbols. And then history begins again. When modern scientists study extinction events, they notice something unsettling. The planet does not simply drift into chaos. It flips. Magnetic fields weaken rapidly. Climate systems destabilize in decades, not millennia. Ice melts catastrophically. Oceans surge. Species vanish almost overnight. These are not gentle transitions. They are hard resets. Now place this beside the ancient accounts. In Sumerian texts, the gods debate humanity's fate before the flood. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods themselves panic when the waters rise higher than expected. In Hindu texts, Vishnu warns Manu of an inevitable deluge tied to cosmic cycles. In Mesoamerican traditions, previous worlds end when the balance of the cosmos breaks. Across cultures, The cause is never human misbehavior alone. It is imbalance. A system pushed beyond stability. This suggests something crucial. The collapse is not emotional. It is mechanical. If the pre-flood kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, then their world was not fragile. It was stable beyond anything we have known, which means its destruction was not accidental. Either the planet itself enforces limits, or someone understood those limits and acted when they were crossed. This is where the most uncomfortable idea enters the discussion. What if the flood was not meant to destroy humanity, but to preserve it? From that perspective, the catastrophe becomes a containment event, a way to prevent a civilization from reaching a level that would destabilize the planet, the species, or something beyond both. The gods do not rage, they calculate, they select survivors, they preserve seeds, animals, bloodlines, and knowledge fragments, and then they withdraw. The withdrawal is just as important as the destruction. After the flood, the gods no longer rule directly. Kingship becomes human. Authority becomes symbolic. Communication becomes indirect. Oracles, prophets, signs. No more descent from heaven. No more rulers who do not age. Why? Because direct governance may only be possible below a certain level of development. Beyond that, intervention becomes too dangerous. This would explain why ancient gods are always described as leaving, ascending, returning to the heavens, retreating behind the sky. It is not abandonment, it is quarantine. If this is true, then humanity is not evolving freely. It is being allowed to progress within boundaries. The Sumerian King List ends its pre-flood account without commentary because commentary would be pointless. The event was final. The system reset. Everything after operates under different rules, and those rules include limitation, shorter lifespans, fragmented memory, slower accumulation of knowledge, reliance on belief rather than certainty. These are not punishments, they are constraints. Now consider the present moment. For the first time since the flood, humanity is dismantling those constraints. Lifespans extend through medicine. Memory externalizes through digital storage. Knowledge accelerates through artificial intelligence. We manipulate genetics. We alter climate. We peer into the structure of reality itself. We are approaching the same threshold again. This is not speculation. It is measurable. Carbon levels, magnetic field weakening, species collapse, technological acceleration. All curves spike together. The same convergence that appears in the geological record before past collapses. The difference now is awareness. Ancient civilizations sensed the pattern, but could not measure it. We can. Satellites watch the poles drift. Instruments detect solar instability. Models simulate cascading failures. The cycle is no longer invisible, which raises the most dangerous question of all. If collapse is part of a system, can it be interrupted? The ancient world may not have failed because it lacked knowledge. It may have failed because it lacked coordination. Isolated civilizations, fragmented communication, local solutions to global problems. They could not respond as a single entity. Humanity can, but coordination requires something civilizations have always struggled to maintain. Unity under pressure. Every collapse myth includes division before destruction, conflicts, power struggles, loss of trust, as if fragmentation itself is a trigger. If the system responds not only to technological thresholds, but to psychological ones, then collapse is not inevitable. It is conditional. This reframes the entire story of the gods. They may not have been rulers. They may have been guardians of a balance humanity repeatedly threatens. Their withdrawal after the flood was not the end of involvement. It was a test. Can a civilization govern itself without destroying the system it depends on? The King List does not answer this. It records the last time the test failed. If the ancient kings were non-human, then their removal marks the handoff of responsibility. Humanity inherited a world without direct oversight. Every myth of judgment, apocalypse, and reckoning is an echo of that transfer. And now for the first time the test returns, not in the form of fire or water yet, but in convergence. Systems aligning, limits approaching, knowledge accelerating faster than wisdom. If the cycle repeats blindly, then collapse is guaranteed. If the cycle can be understood, then the outcome may change. This is why the Sumerian King List matters, not because it proves aliens or gods or lost civilizations, but because it documents a boundary condition, a moment when the rules changed, a line humanity crossed and paid for. The kings before the flood are not important as individuals. They represent a state of civilization, one that lasted for unimaginable spans of time, one that ended abruptly. We are closer to that state now than at any point since. The story is not asking us to believe in gods. It is asking us to recognize a pattern, and patterns do not care whether we believe in them or not. When all the fragments are placed together, the story stops being about ancient kings, gods, or even lost civilizations. It becomes a story about responsibility. The pre-flood world did not vanish because it lacked intelligence. It vanished because intelligence alone was not enough. Knowledge grew faster than restraint. Power expanded faster than wisdom. The system tipped. This is the lesson hidden beneath the numbers, the myths, and the clay tablets. The ancient world reached a level where it could no longer coexist safely with the forces it had unlocked. Whether those forces were planetary, cosmic, or technological hardly matters. The outcome was the same. Reset. The flood was not the beginning of humanity's story. It was an interruption, a forced pause. A moment when the trajectory of an advanced world was cut short so that something smaller, slower, and more fragile could take its place. That fragility was not weakness. It was protection. For thousands of years after, humanity lived within limits. Short lives, slow communication, local impact. The planet could absorb mistakes. Civilizations could rise and fall without collapsing the entire system. Those limits kept the cycle dormant. Now those limits are dissolving. Humanity is no longer local. It is planetary. A single invention spreads globally in days. A single mistake propagates through climate, ecosystems, and economies simultaneously. We are no longer experimenting in isolation. We are modifying the operating conditions of the entire world. This is why the old stories are resurfacing. Not because ancient people were primitive, but because they were witnesses. They lived close enough to the last collapse to remember its shape. Over generations, memory degraded into myth, but structure remained. Long ages, sudden destruction, survivors, restart. What makes this moment different is not that the cycle is returning. It is that we can see it. For the first time, a civilization stands at the edge of the same threshold with awareness. We can trace the warning signs backward. We can compare myths to geology, astronomy to archaeology, numbers to patterns. The ancient kings may be gone, but the data they left behind is still intact. And that data points to a choice. If collapse is automatic, then nothing matters. But if collapse is conditional, triggered by imbalance rather than existence, then awareness changes everything. The cycle does not demand destruction. It responds to it. The pre-flood world may not have been erased because it existed, but because it reached beyond equilibrium. The flood was not punishment, it was correction, which means the future is not written. The Sumerian King List ends where human responsibility begins. After the flood, there are no divine rulers, no immortal kings, no descent from heaven. There is only humanity governing itself, struggling, failing, rebuilding. Learning slowly. That may have been the point all along. If the ancient gods existed, their greatest act was not ruling the world. It was stepping back and seeing whether humanity could learn to hold power without destroying the system that sustains it. We are now closer to answering that question than any civilization before us. The final meaning of the list is not hidden in its numbers, but in its silence. It does not tell us what comes next. It only shows us what happened last time. Whether history repeats itself depends on whether we recognize the moment we are standing in. The flood was the end of a world that did not understand its own limits. The next turning will reveal whether this world does.